All right, good morning, everyone. I think there's less than an hour left in the morning of this day. I apologize for starting this late. It's one of those things where when you wake up later than you want to and you still have preparations to make and you have to make your coffee and all kinds of things, sometimes you just end up starting late and things get pushed back. I would have rather started this about a half hour ago, but it just is what it is. So welcome. Let me make sure I can see myself on YouTube. I see the red insignia there. That means that I am live. If if some of you notice, I look a little different. I made some upgrades. Let me move this back here so I look like the rest of the people in cyberspace. You can see my recording device there, my mic. I have an official mic now. My snowball, my original snowball, that died on me maybe a little around a year, less than a year. I put it in my suitcase. I don't know if it was being beat up in the by the baggage being tumbled around at the airport, being put on the plane, being taken off the plane. But when I got to my destination, it wasn't working anymore. So sometimes things just have a natural life and they expire. And so for the last year, I was using the microphone on the computer, which isn't the highest quality microphone. And so I decided to do a bit of an upgrade. So I have this new mic and a high definition webcam. So you got to make upgrades as you go along in this thing. Okay, so I have a guest, and I want to uh, he's the star for today, not me. I'm not the star of anything. But he's going to talk to us about nuclear power, and this is a very very important topic. And we're going to talk about why. So I'm going to play my intro, which after I come off my August hiatus, I promise I will have a new one. But I'm going to do this. I'm going to share this on my original channel. I'm going to give a brief setup, and then I'm going to bring Connor up. Connor was here on my channel almost, I think it was in the fall. I think it was in the fall. With so many things going on, you sometimes lose track of time. But he's back, and we're going to talk about nuclear power. So I'll see you on the other side of the intro. I'm going to share this on my original channel, and hopefully, well, I'm going to learn something. I know I will, because I always learn something from Connor. So I'll see you on the other side. All right, everyone, welcome back to Big Discussions 76 Science and Technology. Today, we're going to have another talk about nuclear power and nuclear energy. And that is why, in large part, I'm wearing my periodic table. We're going to talk about energy, we're going to talk about the environment, and as I'll describe, uh, hopefully, after my brief intro, I will have convinced you that all of these things are interrelated and all of these things are, it's a very, very complex web of discussions and um, arguments, and that there's just a lot here. Okay, so I'm gonna ground this. I'm gonna ground this in. Well, I'm gonna first ask the question: why does all of this matter, Dr. Dunbar? Why are you talking about nuclear power? Why are you having a guest on to an expert on to talk about nuclear power and nuclear energy? Well, this is a science and technology channel. You could argue that it's science news or it's science topics. I'm trying to make myself a science influencer. But energy, the environment, this impacts all of us. And the world is evolving. You have first world countries like United States that we live in, and the UK and France and Canada and the European countries, the Soviet Union. No, no, there's no more Soviet Union. Russia. There's no more Soviet Union. But you have first world countries, and then you have second and third world countries. And one of the things that, if you're paying attention to the news, one of the things you're seeing is that the United Nations and our world leaders, they're debating energy, they're debating the climate, they're debating the state of the world, and there's a push to get us away from the use of petroleum fuels to electric and alternative fuels, and even in some instances hydrogen, because the one hypothesis, a strong hypothesis, is that we are creating too many greenhouse gases by burning petroleum products. So, but it gets better, because if, assuming your first world countries, we all batten down the hatches and we get rid of our petroleum products, well, the third world countries, they want to modernize themselves as well. They want uh, com- uh, comfy and cushy homes with air conditioning and lights and internet. They want all these things themselves. They want nice highways with all the cars they can put on them. They want all of the luxuries that we arguably take for granted in this country. The third world countries want them as well. So one of the things our world leaders are debating is, well, and even the scientists in energy and climate, is how can we deny the third world countries the luxuries that we have? Do we have the right to deny the third world countries the luxuries that we have? Okay. And so then, if you start watching, because I watch content on this during the week and frequently. So if you watch content on this, one of the other things you see is that some of the modern countries have tried using alternative energy sources like solar and wind. And I don't know enough about it yet, but this has caused a lot of well, hardship and upheaval in countries like Germany. So, and these countries have, from what I'm hearing, they've done a reverse course and have now built uh, coal plants. So they've gone in the opposite direction, because their populations are like, yo, we don't. It's cool to want to do electric and solar and wind, but we have lives to maintain. So there's something about transitioning to these new energies, and there's something about also getting everyone on the same boat. So it's a very, very complex thing. So I started learning a lot about this Earlier this year, I took an interest in the climate debate slash crisis slash thing. I don't, my scientific background, for my scientific background, I don't come from those disciplines. So I'm kind of on the outside looking in, and I'm learning as I go along. And so I've been watching content, I've been researching the climate debate. And so, just briefly, there are two camps here. Actually, there are three that I don't have listed on this slide. There are the climate quote unquote alarmists, and there are the climate deniers. Okay. So, when you think about who, and there are names associated with these two groups. There are names associated with these two groups as you watch this stuff and you study it. So, who does anybody know? I have a small crowd right now. Which name is synonymous with climate alarmist? Okay, I I've upgraded the channel. I've got some a new mic, a new webcam, but I also have some drops now. So we're gonna entertain a little bit now here as well. We're gonna try to make it fun. So one of the names that's synonymous with climate alarmist, and this is not Dr. Dunbar originating this. This is just watching this discussion, like watching a tennis match on the side, on the sidelines like that. Al Gore, former Vice President Al Gore, and this is a drop. These are two drops, and I should have had them queued up. Both of these are excerpts from Al Gore, former Vice President Al Gore, speaking at the World Economic Forum. As soon as the circles do their thing, I will play uh, one of these, well, both of these for you because Al's passionate. And yeah, when you hear Al speak, you want to get up and run through a wall. You want to get up and put on a helmet and some shoulder pads, and you want to attack something. When you hear Al speak, when you hear Al's passion, you want to. Okay, so this is an excerpt of Al speaking at the World Economic Forum earlier this year.
We're still putting 162 million tons into it every single day, and the accumulated amount is now trapping as much extra heat as would be released by 600,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding every single day on the Earth. That's what's boiling the oceans, creating these atmospheric rivers and the rain bombs, and sucking the moisture out of the land. And
Okay, here's another one. And you just, again, you just get pumped up listening to this.
and sucking the moisture out of the land and creating the droughts and melting the ice and raising the sea level and causing these waves of climate refugees predicted to reach 1 billion in this century. Look at the xenophobia and political authoritarian trends that have come from just a few million refugees. What about 1 billion? We would lose our capacity for self-governance on this world.
Boiling oceans, xenophobia. Okay, so Al Gore is arguably the face of that side, the alarmist side. Connor's in the background. I'm going to bring him up shortly. He mentioned Greta Thunberg. So who are some of the faces of the quote unquote denier side? I've mentioned one of them here in this channel. I don't think anyone in my subscriber base knows who Dr. Willie Soon is. I mean, people who are in the climate science world, you know who Dr. Willie Soon is, but I have some Dr. Willie Soon drops as well. So here's one.
But what happened when you do bad science? This is part of the stuff that I have passion about. You know, when you mess around with science, you mess around with me, right?
It's one of my favorite quotes. You mess around with science, you mess around with me. There's a really good talk by Dr. Willie Soon and Dr. John Christy, and this excerpt of Al Gore. All those are in the description box. But Here's another one in response to Al Gore.
It turns out that this climate is among the most misunderstood subject because Al Gore, the average D student, thinks that he understands climate. My God, it's as sure as gravity. He always say that. You guys are just denier, right?
I think that's one of Al's famous sayings. It's as sure as gravity. It's as sure as gravity. So Connor typed this name, Greta Thunberg, in the chat. So who is Greta Thunberg and why is she important?
Please understand, you cannot see CO2, okay? Some kids from Sweden, the lady named Greta Thunberg, say that she can see carbon dioxide, actually. This is how bad it is, right? Instead of going to school to learn that carbon dioxide is in infrared, you cannot see this thing, okay? And she said that she can see CO2. So it's just a bit of a joke.
So the point Dr. Soon was making there is when you breathe out, can you see the CO2? Can you see it? And so the whole premise is for a greenhouse gas, it light's coming in and you're trapping it. But if you can't see the gas, is the gas trapping the light or the heat energy? I know Connor's gonna have something to say about this, but he's associated with the quote unquote denier side. Connor mentioned Greta Thunberg. So these are names. When we start studying this, there are names you hear. On the alarmist side, you hear Al Gore, Greta Thunberg, Dr. Michael Mann, who created the hockey stick model. You hear all of these names, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You hear all these names. And then on the denier side, you hear names like Dr. Willie Soon, John Christy. There were more. I can't think of the rest of them now. But you have two camps, and then you have the rest of the people looking on the sides like this from the sidelines. Okay, so that's an intro to that. So energy. So when you're talking about the environment and you're talking about the earth and human civilization and modernization, all these things are kind of interrelated. The environment, climate, energy, species, preservation. Okay, all these things are interrelated in this one area, in this one set of very, very passionate arguments and debates, all those areas. So energy is a key part of that entire thing, because for us as humans to live, all of this stuff requires energy. And it wasn't until I watched Dr. John Christy's video, which is in the description box below, that I realized, yeah, everything we do in the United States, this computer here, I went to go see Oppenheimer last night, at the movie theater, the powering our vehicles, even going to the hospitals for surgeries and then staying in the hospitals afterwards for however long. Where's the energy going to come from? Can it be safely used? No matter what form we use, is it going to create some kind of waste? So recently, I've had discussions about one of the big things you're hearing about now are the electric cars. Why didn't that show? There it is. There's a pretty picture of an electric car battery. Okay. We're hearing a lot of talk of transitioning over to electric cars from petroleum cars that run on fossil fuels. These cars run on lithium ion batteries, which are composed of, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, Connor, when you come up, correct me, rare earth materials. Okay. And it's going to take energy to extract those rare earth materials, those rare earth metals. Those are designated on my shirt here. It's going to take energy to extract those and put those in the batteries. So there's going to be an energy input somewhere, and it's probably going to generate some sort of waste somewhere. Unless, of course, you can use solar or wind, but the knock on solar and wind is that they're not reliable. So my research has shown that until we come up with a way to store the solar and the wind energy, those are not viable alternative energies going forward. Now there are also discussions about biodiesel. I had someone come and talk about biodiesel in the wintertime. Dr. Well, I don't know if he's a doctor. He's a Juris Doctor, Floyd Vergara Esquire. So he's a doctor. He's a lawyer by background. Biodiesel is in the discussion as well. Hydrogen is in the discussion as well. Renewables. There's a push for renewables. But I don't hear, I'm going to bring Connor up now. I don't hear a lot of people talking about nuclear. And if we're going to go 100% or as much as possible off of the petroleum fuels, and the wind and the solar are not reliable until we can store those stably in batteries of some sort. Where's the energy for the electric cars going to come from? Where's the energy for everything? Where's that energy going to come from? So with that, everyone, I'm going to get out of the way, and I'm going to bring Connor up. And he said he wanted to talk to us about the history of nuclear, but we also have to talk about the future of nuclear as well. And maybe Connor can say, I saw Oppenheimer last night. Maybe Connor can say something about, because there's a hysteria. I mean, from obviously Chernobyl, what happened with that? No one wants that to happen. No one wants what happened with that Japanese. Was it Japanese or Chinese? That Japanese or Chinese nuclear plant. No one wants that to happen, but there's a certain hysteria and fear associated with nuclear. So with all those things said, I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to bring Connor up. He's going to talk to us about anything I talked about, and in addition to the things he wants to talk to us about.
Hey,
Connor, welcome back.
So, how's it going, everybody? Boy, you gotta love Al Gore, man. He's like the bizarro world Alex Jones. He's like just Alex Jones from the opposite end of the spectrum. I remember growing up with An Inconvenient Truth and what was that, 2000, maybe 2001, 2002. And so I guess I'll start off with just a touch on the climate and how the climate cycles kind of go. And then we can move on to nuclear power and how that sort of fits in. So in terms of climate change, the old term for this was global warming. And it always kind of was very much a misnomer, because it's not necessarily fundamentally just a warming. It's just a radical change in the overall long-term climate that we see in different parts of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And when we were talking back in the day about global warming, there was a lot of evidence that Al Gore and people like that put forward to show that the average temperature of the earth was actually rising. That wasn't necessarily good science. A lot of it was they were looking at comparisons of weather stations that had existed between 1960 and 2000, when that first body of research started coming out. And the problem was that they were pointing out that the ambient temperatures in a lot of those weather stations in 1960 was a lot lower than they was in 2000. And that was true. Like, the data actually did show that. But what you also see is that because of the much larger number of human beings on the planet, cities have grown. And so cities had ended up overtaking these weather stations. And so the weather stations were now located in urban environments as opposed to formerly either suburban or rural environments. As you know, an urban environment where things are made out of asphalt and brick and stone is significantly just ambiently hotter than it is if you're sitting in a grassland. So they had failed to sort of take that data into account realistically. And that was what kind of led to a lot of the early body of this work being much more alarmist than it should have been. But the fact is that the climate is changing, and it is changing because of human interaction with it. And a lot of that has to do with carbon. And the reason that we know that is because the Earth actually goes through a number of very long-term cycles. The most common of which you'll see cited is something called a Milankovitch cycle, which has to do with a combination of the axial tilt of the Earth relative to the sun, and certain ellipses in the orbit of the Earth as it rotates around the sun over a very long period of time. Typically, when you add up all these cycles together, you get a cyclic rate of about 100,000 years. And so what you see is that normally the Earth has two cycles in the Milankovitch cycle. It has something called a glacial and an interglacial period. And so during the glacial period, the temperature is much lower. And the camera's mirrored, so I'm coming at it this way. So I got to come at it from this way and hang on, because this is going to wreck my brain. Normally what you'll see at the beginning of the 10,000 year cycle is what's called an interglacial, where the temperature of the Earth spikes very rapidly, comparatively, because we're talking about 10,000 years. But over a very short period of time, comparatively, the temperature spikes up and has a short amount of spike. And then we enter a glacial period where the temperature dips back down quite rapidly and stays much lower. On average, I think it's about 15 degrees centigrade lower than it is typically now in terms of average overall global temperatures. So normally the Earth is much colder than it is. And a lot of people, the deniers, we'll call them deniers, but well, you could call them skeptics, you could call them anything else. A lot of people on that side of the coin like to point to these cycles and say, well, look, the Earth fluctuates constantly in its overarching temperature and how that works. And we're just in the middle of one of these fluctuations. And you can't really positively prove that that's not what's actually going on. You can't prove that the excess amount of carbon in the atmosphere is what's causing the change. And yes, we can. And part of the reason that we know that is because the cyclic rate doesn't change. It's very constant. And so we already had our interglacial period. If you actually look at the record of ice cores that are taken in places like Greenland and Lake Vostok in Antarctica, you can actually get records going back 270, 280, 300,000 years. And you can see for every layer of ice, both the amount of atmospheric change that was in that layer of ice during the year that it fell, and also the amount of atmospheric CO2, because there are these little tiny itty bitty microscopic bubbles that are trapped as the ice forms on itself. And those are just samples of what the Earth's atmosphere was during that year. And so you can actually go down there with a very small needle and you could test the exact ratio of what gases were present in there. So we actually know to a very significant degree what the Earth's atmosphere was composed of for the last roughly 300,000 years. And which time we have the ability to study three of those Milankovitch cycles. So you can actually see how they interact. And here's what happens. We always see a fluctuation of carbon going up and down, because as the Earth warms up, the ocean warms up. And water, and specifically ocean water, is an incredibly good store of atmospheric gases. So cold liquids will actually store gases much more efficiently than warmer liquids will. And if you want to try this at home, go get a can of Coke, put one in the fridge, and leave one on your table. And when one in the fridge is cold, crack that sucker open and listen to the amount of pressure that's released out of that one. And then crack the one that's been sitting on your dining room table and is room temperature open. Listen to how much more pressure is released out of that.
So everyone, what Connor's talking about is Henry's law. Henry's law. So the amount of gas in the atmosphere versus a liquid in which the liquid is in contact with. Go ahead.
Right. So what we should see is if all of the ambient temperature change that we are seeing over the course of the globe was totally natural. Right now, the Earth should actually be cooling off much more than it is, because we're past the interglacial cycle. And so the ocean should act as a reservoir and a store for the excess atmospheric gases that would cause these things. The different axial tilt and orbital plane changes of the Earth as it's going around the sun should act to basically cool the planet off, but it's not. It's actually getting, if anything, slightly hotter. Now, this is not climate alarmist hysteria. This is not Greta Thunberg levels. This is not I should glue my hands to an airport runway in Germany to protest the use of oil kind of a change. It's none of these things. Like so much in science, the actual answer of what's happening falls right in the middle. It's not happening, but it's also not happening to a degree that it's going to kill everybody by the year 2050 and it'll be a totally unlivable place. Like Aquatechi said, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. It's not that either. It's just a fundamental phenomenon that we can actually see and measure. And we know that because we can actually see what the overarching levels of carbon were in our atmosphere relative to previous cycles like this one, and where in the timeline of a cycle we should be. So that aside, that's the climate sort of thing.
So Connor,
Yeah.
I'm gonna we'll just play with this for another minute, and then we can jump into nuclear. Let's play another Al Gore drop. I have another one that kind of gets to this, and I have a question about this afterwards. Something as a scientist myself I thought about. So we'll have another word from Al Gore.
emissions are still going up. All these promises of the last few years to cut emissions are still going up. When are we going to bring these emissions down?
Burning the frogs, gay.
You know, you can't listen to him and not, and I understand now why his associates and followers, why they're so passionate. You can't listen to that and not be passionate about it and not be inspired by it. One of the other things the skeptics or the deniers note is that in this instance, carbon dioxide is, and everyone, if you're, I don't want to be tarred and feathered. I might get tarred and feathered for saying this, but this is the debate people are having. Carbon dioxide is plant food, so the plants love it. And so it occurred to me. I haven't watched all the data. I haven't read all the data. And there's a website you could actually watch the Earth greening, and it's a NASA website. I put it underneath one of my videos. It did occur to me, okay, so we're putting more carbon dioxide up in the atmosphere. Is it just sitting there, or is it going someplace else? Is it all just sitting there and caking up to the point where the oceans would boil, or everything, or this would turn into Terminator 2 Judgment Day, where everything is just eviscerated?
So, you really, the answer is the same sort of moderation of an answer of anything else, because a lot of climate alarmists would like to point to something like Venus and say, well, there's a runaway greenhouse reaction. This is what the Earth's going to be like eventually. And it's not really that true. And yes, carbon dioxide is absolutely plant food. It's what goes into the carbon fixation cycle. It's what causes plants to grow. But you have to look at the long-term history of the planet. Now, human beings, as an agricultural society, have only been here for about, let's be generous, 10,000 years, which is 1/10 of one of the Milankovitch cycles. So essentially, the Earth warmed up, and then we sprang into existence and became the modern human beings before it ever had a chance to cool down. That's essentially what happened. And the Earth's not used to that. And so, yes, if we made a lot of excess carbon dioxide, a lot of that would get uptake by plant life. The majority of it would end up going into ocean algae, which is actually the majority of biomass on Earth. But the problem is that as human beings have become much more and more and more and more numerous, we do things like cut down our forests and replace them with other agricultural plants, which aren't nearly as efficient at taking in carbon, or replacing them with cities, so we don't have any plants to actually take up that carbon. As the ocean warms up, the overall amount of different types of algae that can actually grow in it do increase. So that should actually put kind of a braking effect on the overall ambient carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But the problem is that things like algal blooms and fungal blooms are not good for human beings. They're not good for the overall amount of biodiversity in the ocean itself. So we have a lot more effect on than just pumping carbon to the atmosphere. We have a distinct effect on where it goes. In previous eras of human history, we would have had huge belts of rainforest along South America and Africa, and a lot of those just don't exist anymore. So there's not a whole lot of place for it to go. So yes, there is more and more and more ambient carbon dioxide that just sits in the upper atmosphere and has no place to go, because we have given it less and less places to grow, to go, excuse me.
Okay. All right. So let's transition over into energy. And I think Al has a nice quote for us to get into that.
If you look at all the new electricity generation installed worldwide, 90% of it was renewable. It's now the cheapest source of electricity in almost the entire planet.
Too cheap.
Okay, Connor. Okay, Connor, you're our nuclear czar. Okay.
Yes.
What's happening with this whole energy thing? Say we get rid of all the petroleum.
Yeah.
What's happening?
All right. If we just got rid of all petroleum tomorrow,
Yes.
all of human society would come grinding to a screeching halt, and it would be a terrible, terrible disaster for everyone everywhere, because we're not ready. We're not there yet. And the problem is that I'll get to the development of where we are in nuclear and everything there, but I have to point out that yes, we have Teslas. Not everybody can afford a Tesla. When the weather gets too hot or way too cold, Teslas don't really work as efficiently. We certainly don't have the ability to have battery powered vehicles actually truck our heavy materials across the country nearly as efficiently as we do things like gas powered trucks, trains.
Okay, time out.
Yeah.
Let's unpack this. You said in extreme warm temperatures,
Mhm.
the electrical vehicles don't work as well. What does that mean?
So the efficiency of a battery, of a chemical battery, is hugely determined by the temperature it operates at. And so we've found, even right now, we're finding people in Texas and the part of the southern states that right now today are experiencing a huge heat wave. They lose on average about a third of the overall range of their electric vehicles, purely based on the ambient temperature that they're operating in. And the same is true in reverse in extreme cold weather. And where I'm from in Idaho, last winter it was -30 for a week, and people couldn't drive their Teslas just because the energy efficiency of the battery, the chemical battery as it was working, wasn't there. The charging capacity of batteries, like, you know, there's a huge difference between me being able to fill up the 20-gallon tank of my truck in, I don't know, 2 minutes versus someone having to sit there and wait for 4 hours to actually charge, to get a reasonable charge on their electric vehicle. That's just not how our society is designed to operate. Trying electric trains, you could electrify all the train tracks, but I mean, that would be a huge mega scale engineering project for even just the United States alone, let alone the whole rest of the world. Electric trucks, like semi trucks that could actually haul meaningful loads, that just doesn't exist because electric engines and motors are incredibly good at torque. They have great low area torque, but they run out of battery so fast. Like, so the first generation of electric trucks, like the Ford Lightning and the Rivian, have been shown that if you hook those up to meaningful loads, like you're trying to pull a trailer or with horses or some amount of goods that you'd use a truck for, you can go about 80 miles and that's it. That's what one of the Ford, I believe it was a Ford Lightning owner, but it could have been a Rivian. But one of the two actually has a whole YouTube video about him buying this truck and trying to actually take a trailer across the country. It just doesn't work. So the technology is not there yet. The shipping, trying to get an electric ship to actually ship container ships worth of goods across the Atlantic or the Pacific to get to places to get it international trade the way it needs, isn't there yet. In the 1960s, we had a nuclear powered container ship that actually worked great, but we don't have any of those anymore. Partially because, as you mentioned, the hysteria around nuclear and nuclear power. So in terms of development of nuclear power, I can get to the history, or do you want me to run you through the whole history of the thing and how it works? Do you want me just to talk about where we are now in terms of the climate and what we can and can't kind of do?
Okay, before you go on, I just want to say I want to make a disclaimer because I've had people on the channel who are pro electric cars, who are pro renewables, and who are pro biodiesel. And so if I'm not discounting anything that they've said. If you go back in my library, I've had discussions with them. The whole point of this channel is to discuss both sides of these things. Okay. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there.
There are very passionate people out there about it, and I'm glad they are. I want battery technology to get there. It just isn't yet.
Yeah. So you mentioned trains. Yeah, that would require, you would need to build the infrastructure for those trains. So here, you know about the Northeast Corridor, there are electrical lines from DC all the way up to Boston. You'd have to build that or put something on the ground, like the Hudson River portion of Metro North in New York State. You'd have to restructure these entire routes for that. But even still, the energy has to come from somewhere. The initial energy has to come from somewhere. So Connor, so anyway, nuclear. Yeah, yeah, in all these discussions, I don't really hear anyone talking about nuclear. So you want to give us a history on nuclear, and then
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
So the history on nuclear power used for power generation was developed concomitantly, essentially, with the Manhattan Project. So about the same time frame. It all follows on from experiments that were done in the 1930s by Enrico Fermi that eventually led up to something called Chicago Pile 1, which was the first actual nuclear reactor in the world. And that was housed under a squash court at the University of Chicago. And back then, it was just a series of graphite bricks that were stacked on top of each other, make a pile. That's why they called it Chicago Pile. And to this day, they actually refer to reactors, the core of reactors, as piles because of this. And then they had these bricks of reflective graphite, and then they would put different amounts of uranium in slots inside of this pile of graphite bricks. And then that would actually cause a chain reaction where, for those in the chat, the way that nuclear reaction works is that you bring uranium, specifically uranium-235, next to some more uranium-235. And uranium-235 has a chance to undergo what's called spontaneous fission, where the atom of the molecule is unstable in the way that it's actually designed. And so every so often, one of them will actually just split. It will split apart entirely of its own accord, and then it will release a neutron. And if you can take that neutron and you can do what's called moderate it, where you slow it down, you actually put a medium in the way. Typically, we use water. Sometimes you can use graphite. You can use other materials. But if you use material to get in its way so that it hits this material and slows down enough that it gets in the right energy range and then hits another uranium atom, that neutron will cause that new uranium atom to split and release more neutrons, which then will get moderated, hit more atoms, release more neutrons, and so on. You have a chain reaction, which releases energy. This is how a bomb works.
So Connor, I've come prepared with a visual.
There you go. Yeah, I figured I'd stop. You got something. There it is. Mm-hmm. So
Okay.
yeah, this is the overall structure of what atoms are. So you have the nucleus there, and that's made of protons and neutrons, and then you have the electrons spinning around the outside. This is the whole interlocking rings thing is something called the Bohr model. We know now that that's not actually true, but it's just a really effective way of visualizing it, because the way that electrons really do exist around the outside of an atom is not visualizable to a human mind. It's just not what would be the word? It's not natural for the way that a human brain would think about it, because it has to do with statistics and probability and things like that. But yeah, inside of a proton or a neutron, those are each made up of subatomic particles called quarks. Protons, 2 up, 1 down. So yeah, that's a good. The electron cloud, Aquatechi in the chat. There we go.
So this gives the structure. I'm just noticing this. Mm-hmm. This one I think actually shows what you were just talking about.
Sure.
Actual reaction.
Yeah, there it is. So this is, you have an incident. Well, this is sort of how an atom can split apart. What looks like you have an incident proton, and then you release something called an alpha particle, which is that particle coming off that's 2 red and 2 black.
Yep.
That's a helium nucleus. So that is one way that an atom can release radiation. You have alpha, beta, and gamma radiation. Alpha radiation is just like this picture where you have, it's just a very high-speed helium atom, which is 2 protons and 2 neutrons that leaves the nucleus. The other one is beta, which is an electron that leaves the nucleus, and there are a number of ways that can happen. And then the last one is gamma radiation, which is a very high-energy photon. So very high-energy light will leave the nucleus. So when you have the chain reaction, you can do 2 things with it. So we developed the chain reaction because we developed nuclear power right at the time of World War II, which to the people living in that era of history was truly an existential crisis. It was everybody lives or everybody dies. Either we do this thing now or Germany or Japan will win. And the thing is, people living now are very much divorced from the reality of how that war really was. And you have to read the notes and the memoirs, and you have to read the diaries of people like Oppenheimer and people like Fermi and his ilk, who actually wrote about how terrified they really were that if Nazi Germany actually won the war in Europe and took out the UK, then it would easily just come here and win the war against the United States. And that would be the way the world would be, or that Japan would do the same thing. And it really was the end of the actual, for real end of the world. And 50 million dead kind of shows that that was really true. To someone living in 1945 and 1944, it must really have seemed like this was the end of humanity. If you read Revelations in the Bible, you would have been reading it page by page going, yep, that's true. Yep, that's true. Yep, that just happened. Well, like And you just don't get that kind of reality living now, although I'm sure in some third world countries you probably still do. Were you living in Myanmar, or you're living in Afghanistan not that long ago? So we developed nuclear really during during the crucible of this period in human history. And so we developed it in both directions, as power, but also as a weapon. So if you take that chain reaction and you make a lot of chain reactions happen, where a lot of different atoms, a lot of different nuclei undergo fission at the same time, and you confine that in a confined space, and you try to get as many reactions as you can in the smallest amount of time that you can, all of that energy gets released all at once in a big pulse. And that's what a nuclear weapon is. That's what a nuclear explosion is. That's what took out Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's what you see in all the nuclear weapons testing footage from the 50s. And so that is comparatively much harder to do, which is why it took a lot more technological advancement and a lot more engineering skill to actually make a weapon than it does to make a power generation. Because in the way that a nuclear reactor works, when you actually have uranium next to each other inside of a moderating material, be it water or graphite or whatever else, the amount of fissions that actually go together to make a chain reaction, you want to keep what we call a ratio of 1.0. We call it a K value. And 1.0 means that for every atom that undergoes a fission, it will cause one more atom to undergo a fission. So it's a steady state model that the amount of power you're generating remains completely steady. If you go above it, then you're actually generating more fissions than you started with. And so the amount of power is going to rise above where you want it to. And maybe you want to do that because you want to get to a higher power level and then stabilize things at 1.0 again. And there are ways that you can control doing that. But
so Connor, I have.
Well, hang on. One last point is that in a reactor, you cannot make a bomb. You can't turn a nuclear reactor into a nuclear weapon, because what happens is, in order to actually confine the energy in a space of time short enough to make it a bomb, you actually have to have engineering controls in place. You have to cause an implosion like you see in the movie Oppenheimer, like that actually was used in a bomb, where you're actually containing that energy in a small enough space that it can grow to the point that it will release as a weapon. If you do something like that in a nuclear reactor, you can get a regular pulse of energy, which will just destroy the reactor, and then the reaction is over. You can't ever make a bomb out of a nuclear reactor. It's not physically possible.
Okay, I was going to tell you, I have two generator diagrams here.
Yeah.
I'll show them real quick. You let me know which one you think is the best for you to kind of walk us through. So I have this one here.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Mm-hmm.
Got the two Simpsons cooling towers there.
Oh yeah, the classic.
And then I have this one.
All right, that's a good one.
All right,
that's a good one. So this is a very simplistic diagram of how you make a nuclear reactor. So yeah, Akwateshi's got it again. Create heat, turn water into steam, spin a turbine, and now you've got electricity. So the way that you do that is you have uranium fuel rods that you have arranged into what we call a pile. Now you'll see on the left side in sort of that oval diagram, and that's what we call a reactor pressure vessel, which is a very big, very thick stainless steel, typically stainless steel vessel that we contain everything inside of. So if anything goes wrong, it's contained inside of this gigantic steel tube. And then in order to control the amount of reaction that's present, you have what are called control rods. Those involve an element called boron, which absorbs a neutron and doesn't give it back off again. And so you can control the level of reactivity just like you would control an accelerator in a car. If you want more reactivity in a car, you push the accelerator down. In a reactor, you bring control rods out of the core, so you allow more neutrons to propagate, which causes more fissions, which causes more heat, and that causes more energy. And so you bring water in, and as this is a model of, the picture you have is a model of what's called a boiling water reactor. So as the water heats up, turns into steam in the top part of this reactor pressure vessel, which then goes out through the steam pressurizer into a steam generator, and that will end up actually turning a turbine and causing electricity, where it will condense back down into water, and then it'll bring down through that bottom loop that you see as regular water back up into the core. And so for a water core, in either a boiling water or a pressurized water reactor, or even graphite reactors, you have to cool the core somehow so that the physical heat, the thermal heat that you're generating doesn't cause damage. It doesn't cause metals to melt or things to go bad. So every reactor accident that has ever happened in human history, be it Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, all of those have happened because you have what's called an LOC accident, a loss of coolant accident, where the amount of coolant flowing through the core has somehow stopped. In Chernobyl, it was because of grievous human error. In 3 Mile Island, it was because of a series of engineering mistakes and also some human error. In Fukushima, it was a giant tidal wave that knocked over the external power that actually powered the pumps that forced the water through the core. And so every time that you have ever had a giant nuclear accident like that, it's because the amount of coolant through the core was not sufficient. So we in the nuclear industry are swiftly moving away from using water. Yes, Tony, so it overheats. And that's when you get what's called a meltdown. Meltdown is not necessarily what you think it is. And a lot of people know the meltdown from Chernobyl. And yes, it does function that way, where the core itself, yeah, meltdown. So the cladding, which is the metal that surrounds the fuel rods that are actually in the core, will overheat. And in previous iterations of this, you get something called a zircaloy reaction. This is what you saw in Fukushima, where the metal that's outside that clads the fuel rod is made out of zirconium. And when that heats up to white hot levels, it can actually react with water, forcing water to disintegrate into hydrogen and oxygen instantly. Wow. And that's what actually causes a buildup of hydrogen gas inside of things like the pressure vessel and the containment shield, the containment building. And that's what can light on fire and explode. So when you see these pictures of Fukushima back in 2011 of the whole building just exploding, that's because of a huge overgeneration of hydrogen gas caused by the zircaloy reaction. But the fuel and the metal and all the surrounding metals, the stainless steel operating mechanics and the borated control rods and all of that will melt into essentially something we call corium, which is lava. It's the lava formed by the core of a nuclear reactor that got too hot, and that will then begin to descend according to gravity. And so we engineer our pressure vessels to be able to withstand that, to be able to contain that. So if you saw in Fukushima, for example, the containment vessel was fine. In 3 Mile Island, even though the core did in fact melt down, it never made it through the bottom of the actual giant steel pressure vessel that we house these things in. The reason why a meltdown was so bad in Chernobyl is because it didn't have a containment pressure vessel. The Soviets just didn't build one.
Wow.
So it melted clear through the bottom of the non-engineered containment vessel that Chernobyl had at the time, and then continued going right through the concrete floor that was sitting below it, and then down into the level below that one. And this is why you get meltdowns, is because the core just gets too hot because you've had a loss of coolant. So we are moving towards using something called liquid metals, specifically things that are based on something called NaK, which is a mixture of sodium and potassium, NaK, NaK. And liquid metal coolants have a lot of different ways that they operate. So liquid metals, when they operate in a reactor, generate what are called fast neutrons. So when you're using water, you really slow the neutrons down, water being a very dense material and having very hydrogenous. And the science of how this works is a bit esoteric, and I think it would probably be a little long for the discussion we're going to have. But water causes neutrons to be much slower as they interact with other bits of uranium. And so when you use molten metal, you get fast neutron reactors. And those can still cause fissions just fine, but you actually have a bonus and a benefit there, which is that you can use these fast neutrons to actually interact with uranium-238 outside of the reactor pressure vessel to actually generate plutonium-239. So if you cause uranium-238 to get hit by a neutron of the right amount of energy, it can actually cause a reaction where you end up with plutonium. Now, normally you can't use uranium-238 in a reactor or in a nuclear weapon. It's not fissile enough a material to actually cause the kind of chain reaction that you're looking for. So you take this uranium-238, this depleted uranium that you otherwise have really nothing to do with, and you place it outside the core of a molten salt reactor, and now you can actually what's called breed. You can breed plutonium-239 just by normally running the reactor and generating power. And after a long enough amount of time, you can take this uranium-238, which now has plutonium-239 in it. You can chemically separate the two. You can take the plutonium you've now created out of nothing and make fuel out of it. You can use it in a reactor. Again, you can actually generate more fuel than you started with using nuclear reactions. And the funny part about this is that we've had the ability to do this since 1951, and we've just never done it, really.
Okay.
And this is where we get into the history.
Okay, so Connor, I want to take a pause for a second. I want to point out that, and correct me if I'm wrong, ultimately what we're looking at here is you need energy to turn that turbine. Yes.
Yes.
And the turbine is what generates the what is it, the electrons or
yep. So you generate the electron potential, the electromagnetic potential, which is
right.
Which is what causes electricity.
So you're taking the chemical energy out of those rods and you're creating kinetic energy.
Yeah. So you're taking the nuclear energy out of the nucleus of the atoms in those rods, and you're using that energy to boil water, to make steam, to turn a turbine.
Okay. So that's our energy input right there. So that's why I kept saying it has to come from.
Excuse me.
The energy is going to have to come from somewhere. It has to come from some natural source.
Yeah. You can't get more energy out than you started with. It breaks the second law of thermodynamics. But you can take energy which has been stored in different forms and reuse it. So in this case, nuclear energy was actually formed when the star that preceded our current sun went supernova and exploded. And it's what caused the abundance of heavy materials that exists on our planet today. Yeah, like and subscribe. Smash that like button. Turn on the bell. Check me out on Instagram. Check him out on Instagram.
All right, we need to know what your Instagram handle is.
Oh, I don't have one. Check him out. Check him out on Instagram. Buy his merch. Buy a T-shirt. There you go. I had to show for you.
I appreciate that. Okay, so chemistry. Let's do the chemistry real quick. So uranium, that's the starting material, right?
Yep.
Okay, and where's the plutonium come in?
So the plutonium works in a fast neutron reactor, so a liquid metal cooled reactor, and you're breeding plutonium. So let's all right. I have very few things that I can go for a visual aid here because I'm sitting in a hotel room at a professional conference right now. Y'all forgive me. But
that's okay.
Let's say that this towel right here is my core, right? So this is all of the control rods and all of the fuel rods that I've now put into a core. And this is where my chain reaction is coming from. This is what the liquid metal surrounds, and this is what is causing my energy generation. So I'm taking what would be to us a useless material, uranium-238, and I'm bringing a bundle of it and I'm putting it right here on the outside of the core. So the uranium-238 is not contributing to the amount of energy the core is actually making. All it's doing is sitting outside of it and absorbing neutrons which are going away from the core. And as that's happening over time, the neutrons will hit this uranium-238 and turn it into plutonium-239, which is fissile. And so after this core's life cycle is done, say we've had 4 or 5 years of this core, and now the amount of energy that it's producing is less than we were looking for. So we take this core out, and now I have this bundle of uranium, which has been sitting outside the core, which now has plutonium-239 in it, and I can do chemistry to this bundle to get the plutonium back out, which then I can use to sinter into new fuel rods to make a brand new core with, and we can keep going. And as long as I have uranium-238 to work with, which there's an enormous abundance of in the Earth comparatively, then we can just keep making reactor fuel forever.
Okay, so before we go on, and we're just about at an hour now. I know there were two videos that you wanted me to share or show the audience. I just want everyone to keep in mind why this is important. A couple of weeks ago, I was having dinner with two other colleagues, two other scientists, well, actually 3, and I told them I was into content creation, print and video. The majority, a good chunk of our population is, in my opinion, distracted with so many other things, so that when election cycles come around, you look up, you've been watching reality TV and all kinds of other things, and then you want to know what the politicians are talking about. You want to know what they're saying. You want to know if the messages you're getting from the mainstream news outlets, are those messages valid? So if you're not studying these things or reading these things, or if you have no knowledge, you're at the mercy and you're beholden to what they say. And I think a lot of people are herded that way. So this is a topic that's going to affect all of us. And there are a lot of people who are not paying attention and who are just not in the know and who are just not interested. So that's one of the reasons why this is important. This is going to impact everybody going forward.
This really will. So the fact is that nuclear power is the only path forward. Now, I'm not saying that because I'm in the nuclear field. And if you want to ascribe bias to that statement, go ahead. It really doesn't matter to me. That's the only actual truth of the matter. You can install all the solar panels you want, but in order to mine the materials to make those solar panels, currently, you still have to use fossil fuels to do that. You can make all the wind turbines you like. Currently, you still use an enormous amount of fossil fuels to mine the materials to make it. And also, for the record, wind turbines actually use an inordinate amount of balsa wood, which is not a renewable resource currently.
They use what?
Balsa wood. The same wood you make toy planes out of. So that you can also make them out of different types of carbon fiber, and they're expanding away from that. But a lot of older generation wind turbine blades actually used balsa wood. And so that was not a renewable resource. But the fact is that there is always going to be time when there's no sunlight. There's always going to be time when there's no wind. And there is always going to be an inordinate amount of demand for electricity, especially as battery technology develops, as the amount of electric vehicles proliferates, as we, if we really did put in the infrastructure for electric trains across this country, which I wish we would, if we really did try to electrify as much as possible, then the only way to satisfy that demand is to have what's called a baseline load capacity, meaning that the average amount of electricity capacity is enough to satisfy the average amount of electricity demand. And the only way to do that is to have nuclear power in a carbon-free way, is to have nuclear power exist enough that it can satisfy that baseline load capacity. And then from there, you can have all the wind power and all the solar power you want that will supplement the amount of electricity that you have available. And in certain areas of the country, like if you're talking about Arizona, Nevada, Las Vegas, you can use a lot more solar power than you can nuclear power, because on average, you actually have a lot more capacity for solar power generation. But you're still going to need a nuclear reactor to sit as the baseline load capacity, and then use wind or solar on top of that. That's how you get to a carbon-free future.
Okay. Now, as you were saying that, Connor, I was just thinking that, for all the pro Tesla people and all the everyone building charging stations and everyone advocating for these things, that part never gets discussed. Where are the inputs going to come from if we get rid of all of the petroleum?
Yeah.
Where are the inputs going to come from?
It has to be nuclear. There's no other option. There isn't another option. There's no other option that could actually provide enough energy to satisfy humanity's need, its baseline load capacity. And so this gets actually back into the discussion of the climate and the third world and how you do that. Because if, say, we wave our magic wand and spread our pixie dust, and all of a sudden the entire United States of America and Canada and Mexico, and let's be generous, we'll call it Europe too, just has nuclear power plants spring up like roses. And all of a sudden everything in the first world is now magically electrified. That takes a stunning amount of investment and engineering knowledge and skill and physics and political stability to be able to make any of those things happen. So you turn to the third world and you say, hey guys, we decided to not use oil and you guys shouldn't either. Well, somebody in Burma who never had a chance to even try a pumpkin spice latte, let alone have running water in their house, is going to tell you to go fuck yourself. Excuse me, but and they're right to say it. Like that would be exactly what I would say too. And I've lived in some of these places. I've lived in Western China. I remember living with a guy in Tibet where the only way that he could heat his house or cook his food was to actually burn yak dung. It was a dung fueled stove in the back of his house. And that produces this dark black smoke that you feel like you're choking on every time you just enter into his house, and using old style oil lamps. And, you know, a lot of people have terrible life expectancies in these areas, partially because of that as an application. Like, they've never had access to medicine, let alone clean breathing air inside their own house. Because in order to even keep it warm enough to live there, you have to burn biomass, in this case, yak feces. So, you know, the way that you get to a future, what are we going to have, you know, massive wind farms in Tibet? Are we going to have massive solar farms all across Myanmar? No, you're going to make small and efficient nuclear reactors that you can give to these places, that you can help install in these places, that will actually allow them to have an abundance of energy and the ability to develop as a people. And that's what we're working on. What we're trying to do is get to a place with, we have two concepts there, either called small nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, SMRs, or we have something called microreactors. And these are designed to give somewhere between tens of megawatts of energy to even a few hundred megawatts of energy. And we want eventually to make these as something that we would term a nuclear battery, which is where it's a nuclear reactor that's about the size of a shipping container. So it would fit on the back of a semi truck. And for a very small town, say, you know, a few thousand people, think a small village or hamlet someplace, a few thousand people, 5, maybe 10,000 people. In order to generate enough power to satisfy demand of that population, you could truck one of these bad boys in, install it outside of the town that they live in, and then you could run it for about 10 years without, you don't have to replace the fuel or anything. It's good for about 10 years, and you use it as a power generating reactor. And then when its usable life cycle is up, you take it back out, put it on the back of a truck, ship it back to where you got it from, and then you bring another one in, plop it down, and you're ready to go. It's plug and play, just like a AA battery, except on grand scale. And that's what we're trying to develop right now at Idaho National Laboratory, and also the other national laboratories. I mean, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Lawrence Livermore, we're all trying together to really work on these designs. And that's the future that we look forward to. And we're actually very close to doing that. The technology to be able to do that has existed since 1951. And we've been running reactors of exactly this type up until 1994, when it was shut down by Bill Clinton, unfortunately, because of political reasons. And so we can easily develop this technology again. The Army's had the ability to do this since 1965. So this is not like, when you're talking about, you know, transitioning to this beautiful carbon-free electric future that somebody like Al Gore would envision, humanity's not there yet. The technology doesn't exist. The technology to be able to make nuclear reactors everywhere does exist, and we've had that within our grasp for a very long time. So just having the political willpower to do it is what's changing now.
Okay, I'm gonna read 2 comments here, and then I have a question for you about safety, because I think that for the general public, that's what most people are going to focus on, in addition to the availability of the energy.
Yeah.
Ronan says, I've taken the Eurostar and TGV in France, and until Americans have the experience of using true high-speed rail, they will never understand what we have been deprived of. Okay, maybe one day I'll.
Can I point something out to Ronan real fast?
Go ahead.
So Ronan, you are exactly right. We need some high-speed rail in this country, and we needed it yesterday. But the fact is, we don't have it, and the reason why France has it, and Britain to a lesser extent has it, and Japan has it, and we don't, is actually really simple. Because France and Germany and Japan lost the Second World War. All of their infrastructure was bombed completely to smithereens by the Allies, France, Germany, and Japan. And so in 1945, they didn't have a rail network. So they were able in the 1950s and 1960s to actually replace what rail network had existed before with high-speed rail, because they were starting from a clean slate. The rail network that we have in this country was built in the 1870s, and some of it was earlier than that. And because of that, it doesn't have the grade curves that high-speed rail needs. It doesn't have the kind of rail that high-speed rail needs, and we don't have the land rights to actually straight shot corridors that high-speed rail would need, because it's all privately owned. The government was never able to take it because it was built in the 1870s when rail went 60 miles an hour. So our rail network continues to go 60 miles an hour because that's what it was designed to do. And unless we want to blow it up and start again, we don't really have that as an option, unfortunately.
Right. That's a whole topic in itself there. What it takes to build a high-speed rail network.
Oh yeah.
That's a whole
I
topic
wish
right
we
there.
could. I would blow it up and start again, but it's not up to me.
Yeah. Diaspora L says nuclear power can't be denied. However, that's pretty extreme, not only for the exclusion non-green, but the lack of faith of increment advancement in infrastructure.
Oh, I think you may have gotten something else than I wanted there. Is I absolutely want to transition to a future where we have green, to transition to a future where we have the battery ability and the storage ability to actually use a lot more wind and a lot more solar, and use, in fact, over time, less nuclear. I would love for us to invent a whole new type of power generation that doesn't rely on any of the kind of generation that we use now. I would love for us to make that kind of leap as a people. And I have faith that we'll get there. But the point is that to transition from where we are now to that future is going to take mostly nuclear power. And that's just the way of it. There's not even really an argument there. That's how it has to happen.
Okay. I want to thank Aquatechie for the generous Cash App. I appreciate the continued support, Aquatechie. If anyone else wants to make a donation to the channel and to this stream, Connor's giving us a lot of valuable information. My Cash App and PayPal are there. So, Connor, the general public, when they hear nuclear, one of the biggest things they're going to think about, or one of the things first and foremost they're going to think about, is safety.
Right.
So we mentioned Chernobyl. We mentioned some other accidents. Would you say that the technologies today are relatively safe?
Yes. So I'm going to use a term here that is an industry standard term that I hate, and I'll tell you why I hate it. So the technology using molten salt reactors, they call it, the engineering term is inherently safe. I hate that term, and I think you can probably understand why I would hate that term. You and I were both toxicologists. We're both risk assessors. Like, we both understand that there's, like, labeling something that is always going to be false. There's no such thing as inherent safety. But like I said, with every nuclear reactor accident that has ever occurred, with the exception of one, but we'll get into that one later. So Chernobyl, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, the ones that people are familiar of, was caused, like I said, by a loss of coolant. So the amount of coolant flowing through the core stopped for some reason. There are different reasons why it stopped. But because of that, the core got too hot and then melted. And that's what, in Chernobyl's case, causes a massive explosion. In Fukushima's case, caused a hydrogen explosion caused by partial melting. And in the case of 3 Mile Island, it just caused the reactor core to brick up in the bottom of the pressure vessel, and nothing really happened. So molten salt cannot do that. And so we've actually proved this principle. And you can actually go online. If you look up a video right now called Pandora's Promise, you can find it on either on PBS, and I believe a free version is on YouTube. But this is where we'll get into a brief moment of the history, if I could. So Idaho National Lab, where I work, was actually started in 1949 as the National Reactor Testing Center in Idaho. And this was an offshoot of a group of guys who had, like Walter Zinn, who at that point was the director of Argonne National Laboratory. And he had also worked on the Manhattan Project. In fact, all the guys had worked on the Manhattan Project. A brilliant physicist and a student of Enrico Fermi. And so he had gotten into the concept of using this molten salt to breed plutonium, like I said. Now, this was the middle of the Cold War. So the reason they wanted to breed plutonium was actually to make weapons. It had nothing to do with actually using it as fuel or power. They wanted to make weapons cores, because this was 1950, 1951. And so we built the first power generating nuclear reactor in the world, which is EBR-1. And in fact, it still stands to this day. You can actually come out to Idaho and visit it. It's a national historic place. And it's on the Register of Historic Places, and you get stamps and everything. Pandora's Promise, there you go. So the way that it worked was exactly the way I described. So it had a molten salt coolant that flowed through the core. And the molten salt caused the neutrons coming from the core to be fast instead of slow like you get with water. And because they were fast, that causes you to be able to generate plutonium. But liquid sodium coolant, liquid NaC, sodium potassium coolant, has an extra property, which is it has so much more inertia in its movement than water does because it's a liquid metal. And so what happens is, normally if you're pumping water through the core of a reactor, you need an external pump, a mechanism to actually cause the water to keep flowing through a reactor. But for a molten salt reactor, you normally do have a pump like that working. But what can happen is the molten salt actually comes up the bottom of the reactor. You got your reactor core here. and it gets heated up by its passes through the reactor core, and that heat causes expansion. But this is a liquid metal we're talking about. So the expansion causes a thermal expansion in the liquid metal, which causes it to rise to the top. Hot things rise, like hot air will rise to the top of a room. And so the molten salt will now rise naturally to the top of the reactor as it's getting heated up, where eventually we'll get to the top and it will cycle back. It will cycle back down the loop, which is the loop is what's connected to a heat exchanger. And that's where you actually boil water, because the hot metal, the liquid metal that's been heated up in the reactor now touches another pipe containing water. And as it touches that pipe, the thermal heat is transferred between the molten salt and the water and causes that water to boil into steam. Steam turns the turbine, and that's how you get power. So as this loop, what's called the primary loop, comes out of the reactor, the molten salt begins to fall downwards. And because of that fall due to gravity and its vastly increased inertia, what happens is it will naturally push itself back into the reactor. And the heat of the reactor will naturally, without any external force, cause it to rise to the top, fall down, rise to the top, fall down. We've done this experiment in 1980. This is where, yeah, I said, yeah, Aquatechi's good. Are you an engineer, brother?
Yeah, Aquatechi, what do you do? You're
Techi. I've been saying Techi, Aquatechi.
I think it's Techi.
Techi, man. You might be a hydrological engineer, hydrologist. But
he knows the stuff.
Yeah, he does. So what happened is, and we did this experiment in 1980, where we had EBR-1 was the reactor prototype that we developed in 1950. And this led in 1957 to the development of another one called EBR-2, which was much bigger. And you can still see the remains of this at INL right now. It's a big, giant metal dome. And it was a several 100-megawatt thermal reactor. Database admin. Well, you know your stuff anyway, man. And this EBR-2 successfully generated power, usable electric power. It powered all of INL, all of our operations, and in fact, some of Idaho, the city of Idaho Falls, which we sit next to, for over 30 years, and it ran successfully. And in 1980, we actually did this test where we intentionally shut off all of the coolant pumps to this reactor. We simulated what would happen if we had a loss of cooling potential, a loss of coolant accident to this giant reactor. And the only thing that happened was it very, very slowly wound itself down until eventually it was in a stable and cold configuration without any human intervention whatsoever. And so this is why the term is inherently safe, although that is a terrible misnomer and nobody should ever use it, because as long as the molten salt has the ability to propagate through the core, it will continue to, just on its own and naturally. And this is the design elements that we're using for the new reactor designs, the plug and play type reactors, so that you could basically essentially put them in place, cause them to go critical where they're now generating power, and just have a bare minimum amount of human intervention necessary to even run them. And the worst thing that could happen is that you just brick the reactor, is that you lose the power or cooling ability, and eventually the reactor shuts itself down, and then that's it. Well, now you need another one. Well, that's okay. You didn't cause a reactor accident, because sodium and potassium coolant need a little bit of ambient heat to actually stay as a metal. At room temperature, it will solidify. So if something goes terribly wrong, the reactor will shut itself down, and then the sodium potassium coolant will actually flash into a solid, throw out all the pipes and plumbing and everything of your primary loop. And so you can't really get that back. You can't take like a heat gun and try to melt it again. You've had it there. Your reactor's had it, but it's in a solid and stable configuration, and it's not generating power anymore. So you can just, like I said, if we have a nuclear battery concept, you can just jack that one up, send it back to the manufacturer, and get a new one.
Okay. I guess the Miami Dolphins have a center named Connor Williams.
Oh, for real?
I don't know. I guess.
I know there's an Indian cricket player named Connor Williams, but
okay.
One day I'll Google something and it will come up with me, but that will be a long day away.
Well, Connor Williams, we are at 1 hour and 20 minutes. We're supposed to have lunch, so let's see.
Well, do you want to have a couple minutes where the audience can ask questions? I'm happy to answer anything.
Yeah. If you have any other questions, please let us know. Once again, if you're new, please subscribe. Please share this information out. Again, this is knowledge I think the general public needs to.
Wayne Wallace.
No. And if you want to make a donation, my Cash App and PayPal are there.
Let's see. Hot swap reactor pods. Yeah, he knows what I'm talking about. A lot of NIMBY is not in my backyard. Ronin 5.0. Yeah, use the depleted uranium to make armor-piercing ammo. Yes, we do that.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So it's not true. To get in the physics of high energy, short span of time, shearing mechanics is interesting. A lot of people will say that depleted uranium, as the bullet strikes armor, will actually what they call self-sharpen, where the tip will break off and cause a new sharper tip to be exposed underneath, and it will push its way through armor. It doesn't actually happen like that, but it's just a manifestation of the fact that depleted uranium is very, 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 very dense, way denser than gold, way denser than lead. And so a very dense object moving at incredibly high speed will just simply force its way through armor. And the unintended yet in warfare appreciated effect is that when you do that to uranium, you heat it up to white hot levels, and uranium is in its atomized elemental form is pyrophoric. It wants to burn with oxygen. So as the bullet actually exits the inside of a tank compartment through the armor, it will actually spontaneously combust into a giant white hot fireball and burn everything.
Ronan says, I was a former U.S. Army medic.
There you go. So a lot of people give depleted uranium rounds a bad rap for making uranium exist in the soil, and a lot of people have said that they have experienced health effects as a result of either handling them or being in the vicinity of where they were used, and it's just not really true. Like, depleted uranium is uranium-238. It falls to the ground, it sits in the soil column, and it stays there. And even inhaling it in the amounts that you would inhale it in a dust storm is just not really going to cause human health effects. It will cause kidney failure long before it will hurt you with radiation.
Connor, you have a question here.
All right.
It says, I don't know if you know anything about this.
Yeah, there you go.
That's your thoughts on Lockheed and TSA crashing atoms through the device at light speed. Is there any real danger?
Right. TSA, the Transport Security Administration, the guys with blue gloves at an airport? Lockheed crashing atoms through the device at light speed. Kenshawn, if you want to rewrite that with a little more specificity, I think I could probably answer the question. Which device are you talking about? That would help. Crashing atoms through a device at light speed. Well, I mean, we crash photons of light at light speed all the time. We can crash atoms through something called the phase speed of light. Actually, Anwar, look this up. Look up on Google real quick a picture of something called Cherenkov, Cherenkov radiation.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Give me the spelling again.
Cherenkov radiation.
Oh, there it is. It came right up.
It'll be a picture of a bright blue glow. Oh, maybe CERN. Yeah, Mike Rizzi might be right. Maybe CERN. But I'm going to give Kenshawn a chance to ask that one more time and see if he wants to be specific about it. But yeah, Anwar, if you can pull that photo up, this is what happens when you actually have atoms. There you go. Yes, go faster than the speed of light. All right, so that very first picture, actually, that Wikipedia picture, that comes from a reactor that I actually work with called ATR, which is the Advanced Test Reactor, which exists up at Idaho Falls. So that's a picture of the inside of the core when it's running, and it's sitting under a big tank of water. Yeah, that's perfect. So that bright blue glow is essentially a light boom. So all of you are probably familiar with the sonic boom of what happens when a plane goes faster than the speed of sound. You get the big boom effect as it actually punches through the barrier, the speed of sound. So in a nuclear reactor, you can cause certain particles, electrons typically, but I mean neutrons, protons, depending upon the amount of energy you're working with, to actually go faster than the speed of light in water. So it's something called the phase speed of light. So you can make a particle go faster than the speed of light in a medium. Nothing can ever go faster than the speed of light in a pure vacuum. That the letter C, that is the speed limit of the universe. But you can make things go faster than how fast light goes in certain mediums like glass or water. And when you do, you get this cascade of electromagnetic ionization, which is what leads to this beautiful blue glow. And it's fascinating to watch it for real in real life. No picture will ever do it justice, but it's kind of like for human beings, it's kind of like moths to a moth lamp outside. When you see it for real, it's so beautiful. Like the only thought in your head is, I want to go touch it. And it's such a weird feeling. It's beautiful in such a dangerous and deadly way, in the same way that like watching a nuclear mushroom cloud is beautiful and gorgeous, but you wouldn't want to actually really be near one.
Yeah, that is a beautiful image.
Yeah. So Ronan, thanks, Aquatech. I appreciate that.
Yeah, he says, well, you know, he's been here once before.
Yeah.
So, but maybe we should try to make this a little more regular.
Sure, I can do that. So Kenshan says CERN. All right, so yeah, I got you. So you're talking about CERN. So you're just talking about particles impacting each other at incredibly high speeds, not the speed of light. We can't make them go the speed of light. Even now, we can't really make them go the speed of light in free air. But no, there's not any inherent danger from doing that. All that we're doing that, the reason we're doing that is well, let me explain this better. You have a packet, a very small amount of atoms that you shoot down a beamline one way, and you have another packet of high energy atoms that you shoot down a beamline another way. And you do it, and you magnetically confine them into such a small space that the atoms actually on the other side of this track and on the other side of this track smash into each other at incredibly high speeds. And the reason we're doing that is we want the atoms to actually fly apart. We want to break the protons into its constituent subatomic particles, like you could see in that photo there. We want to see the quarks as they come out of the envelope of the proton. We want to see the different forces that are involved. We want to see things called bosons, Higgs bosons. We want to see the interactions of the nuclear strong force, the weak force. We want to see strange quarks and exotic new things that we haven't seen before. We want to see how the universe works at a very small level. But at the end of the day, all that you're doing is taking an infinitesimally small bunch of gas and shooting another infinitesimally small bunch of gas at it. And then just causing, if you were to actually sit outside of the tube when this collision happened, you wouldn't even notice that it happened, because the amount of actual energy that you're releasing is tiny, teeny tiny, itty bitty. You're just trying to focus on the amount of energy that's being released in an infinitesimally small amount of space. But essentially you're going, like me breathing has more energy involved than the actual collision energy that you'd be standing next to.
Okay. So Connor, we're at an hour and a half. Do you want me to cue up the Konstantin video?
What'd you say? Oh, yeah. If you pull up Konstantin Kisin, and he's at about 3:30 is the mark where he makes an excellent point about how the climate is going to work in the third world, essentially. So for reference, this is a fella having a debate at Oxford University about, the majority of the debate is about politics, you know, Britain's left or right politics, which is broadly similar to ours. But in the middle here, he makes an excellent point about climate change and the argument about climate change.
Connor, as an aside, did you see the footage of that parliament in Kosovo where the fight broke out?
Oh, I haven't yet.
Okay. If you get a chance, take a look.
Yeah.
Despite what people think, politics, well, I think the population is more violent than our politicians. Our politicians never engage in fisticuffs or dousing each other with water.
Well,
but in other countries, the politicians roll their sleeves up and they fight each other.
If you study American history, you'll actually know that in the lead up to the Civil War, two senators went at it with a fireplace poker and a set of tongs in the Senate floor.
Wow. Okay. So I think the rule, Connor, is every 10 seconds you got to stop it?
All right, sure. Yeah.
Okay. So fair use.
Can only do one thing. You know why? This country is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which means that if Britain was to sink into the sea right now, it would make absolute.
Yeah, if you can let him finish the point by point. I don't think you're going to get copy struck for this, because this is actually a free release to the public from Oxford anyway.
Okay. Then I'm gonna for completeness, I'll take it back to where you started. So I'll go to 321.
And for reference, for any YouTube arbiter out there, we're actually viewing this in its entirety as an educational material in order to provide commentary and criticism on it later, which is absolutely under US law defined completely as fair use.
Thank you, Connor. Fair use.
You know why? This country is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, which means that if Britain was to sink into the sea right now, it would make absolutely no difference to the issue of climate change. You know why? Because the future of the climate is going to be decided in Asia and in Latin America.
Okay, let's unpack that for a moment. What does that mean?
Right. So the amount of energy that it took for places in what we continue to call the first world, something being in the first, second, or third world was actually a definition based on Cold War, which doesn't really exist anymore. But we'll call it the first world, meaning Western Europe and America. So the amount of energy that it took for the population of those places to develop to the point and quality of life that we have now is the amount of energy that caused the carbon that we currently have in the atmosphere. It's also what caused huge amounts of damage as we misunderstood the applications of various chemicals coming up, like pesticides, like chlorofluorocarbons, which ruined the ozone layer, adding lead, tetraethyl lead into gasoline, things like that. The damage that we've done to our environment is directly in ratio to the amount that we as Western Europe and America have developed to the quality of life we have now. But that's a very, very, very small percentage of the overall Earth's population. So if we're expecting the rest of the Earth, everyone in China, everyone in India, everyone in Latin America, everyone in Indonesia, everyone all over the other parts of the less developed world to reach the same quality of life that we have, under how we normally do it now, using carbon, using fossil fuels as energy, using chemicals to influence our environment, the amount of change to our environment that it would take for that to happen would cause severe damage to the planet.
Okay, I'm going to go to his next point.
By poor people who couldn't give a shit about saving the planet. No, thank you. No, thank you. It's going to be decided by poor people in Asia and Latin America who don't care about saving the planet. You know why? Because they're poor.
Yeah.
So poor people, well, number one, they want a better quality of life, but they're probably not thinking about all of these fine details me and you were talking about.
Right. Well, you get into short-term loss and short and long-term loss. So if you're someone whose life is such that you could die of malnutrition tomorrow, your time and energy, your existence is focused on eating today. That's where you live. That's where your mindset is. And so if someone says, well, you know, you shouldn't eat today because it'll cause the planet to be better 10 years from now, you would tell someone to fuck off, because that's not where your mindset is. That's not what you're trying to accomplish. The only reason why Western Europe and America and us here actually have even the freedom to care about what happens to the planet long term is because we are so rich and we have so much abundance that we actually have the luxury of even doing that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because they're poor. I come from Russia, which is not a poor country, it's a middle-income country. 20% of households in Russia do not have an indoor toilet.
Johnson, why are you naked?
Oh.
Because my t-shirt sucks. Look at Gibson. He's wearing a true classic tee.
There you go.
What they have is an outdoor toilet. And I don't mean one of those nice portaloos that we get here. I don't even mean a Glastonbury portaloo. I mean a wooden shack with a hole in the ground that holds a collected fermented memory of the last 10,000 visits. How many of you are going to go home tonight and say, let's rip out our bathroom and erect a Siberian shithouse in the back garden?
So that's a commentary on just quality of life and infrastructure. You know, as bad as our critics of this country who live here, as bad as they say this country is, if you have a home, it probably has a working toilet that's connected to the sewage system or a sewage system. So, so a little bit longer.
Yeah, a little bit. I think he's got like another minute there where he actually talks about his own choice that he would make in a similar bit.
Okay.
And if you're not, why should they? 120 million people in China do not have enough food. I don't mean that they don't get dessert. I mean they suffer from malnutrition. That means that their immune system is breaking down because they don't have enough food. You're not going to get them to stay poor. Imagine you're Xi Jinping, the leader of China. When you were 10 years old, there was a revolution, a cultural revolution in your country, and people came and they put your father in prison. Your mother had to denounce him. Your sister killed herself. And you, no longer enjoying the protection of your formerly powerful father, were sent to a village where you lived in a cave house. And here you are, decades later. You have clawed your way up the bloody and greasy pole of Chinese politics to be the undisputed supreme leader of the very Communist Party that destroyed your family.
So he's got a little bit extra here, which I think makes a very important point.
All right. And for the record, I did not know. I'm not familiar with the living conditions in China, so I'm learning here with everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that the main thing you have to do to survive and to stay in power is to deliver the one thing that the people of China want: prosperity, economic growth. Where do you think climate change ranks on Xi Jinping's list of priorities? A third of all children who live in extreme poverty in the world live in India. That means they're starving and dying of preventable disease. Now, about 15 months ago, my wife got pregnant. Not me, because we're old school.
Sorry?
I said, let him finish this point here, and then we can be done with this bit.
All right. Fair use, YouTube. Oh, I see what he did there. I see what he did there.
Yeah, you want to back that one up real fast?
Yeah. This is gonna offend somebody, but
who cares?
I see what he did.
Me, because we're old school.
Wait a minute.
There you go.
And dying of preventable disease. Now, about 15 months ago, my wife got pregnant. Not me, because we're old school. And for 9 months, we talked about what our boy would look like, what he might do when he grows up. We looked at baby scans and videos on YouTube about what the fetus looks like at 9 months and 12 months and 20 months. And eventually he was born. And he is this cute little bundle of joy. He's cuter than about 80% of puppies, right? Now, if you said to me that I had a choice, either my son had a serious risk of starving or dying from a preventable disease in the next year, or I could press a button and he would live. He would go to school. He would bring his first girlfriend home. He'd go to university and graduate and become a woke idiot. And then he'd get a job and get married and have children and become a man. But all I have to do is press this button. And for every day of my son's life, a giant plume of CO2 is going to get released into the atmosphere. Now, you're all very young, and most of you are not parents. Let me tell you something. There is not a parent in the world who would not smash that button so hard their hand bled.
There you go.
More?
No, that's the point. You know, it brings home the human aspect of it, is that every choice for the climate also becomes an individual choice at some level as well. Like you can make policy all you want, but you can't order somebody to stay undeveloped, to stay in the third world, to stay poor and facing risks of things like starvation while people like us drink pumpkin spice lattes at Starbucks. It's just not going to happen. And the only way that you develop anything, the only way that human beings have ever developed, the only way that you actually make infrastructure, you make medicine, that you keep the lights on, that you keep the heat on, is by generating power, by using electricity, by using energy. It comes down to energy. And so in order to bring us into a future where humanity as a composite whole has enough energy to actually survive and thrive, the only way to do that is to actually have a foundation of nuclear power and then build on top of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, Connor, I'm gonna just after listening to all this, I'm just gonna say what my mother normally says when I start talking about science or anything else that kind of goes too far out there. It's in the Bible.
There you go.
That's what my mother does. Every time I go home and I start talking about Milankovitch cycles and carbon dioxide not absorbing and all these other things, she takes it back to it's in the Bible.
Base.
The earth is going to burn up eventually.
Base, mama. Now,
by God's hand.
There you go.
I see some laughs there in the chat. I suspect your parents, maybe you guys have a mother like mine. God bless my mom. She's
I counter that. Every time I counter that, no man knows the day or the hour, mama. So we got to.
Well, the theory is the sun is going to go supernova at some point, right? I mean, it's going to be. None of us are going to see that, fortunately.
Yeah.
But so, depending upon how you interpret prophecy,
well, I'll tell you what I do.
If man doesn't burn the earth up, the sun will. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. What I do is, like Konstantin Kisin said before, the only thing that I can do is I can strive to leave a world for my children that I would hope that they would grow up in. And so I work at Idaho National Lab, and we all work here trying to develop this system of power such that I can actually make the world a better place. Not just talk about it, not just do what a politician would do and say what I wish would happen, not just write poetry about what could be, but actually build it for real. Actually do what humanity has always said we could do and what we can do. And so, you know, the earth might burn up tomorrow and a third of the ocean may boil away and the comet may strike and I'll see Jesus. But until that actually happens, since no man knows the day or the hour, I'm going to keep working to build what I can while I've got the chance.
Okay. So Connor, I'm going to take us out with two comments from Al. So Al's going to take us out and now I want to ask you a question about one of them. So we're gonna go out with some words he had about the cop, not the cop, something else.
Now we have the COP process. Okay. What do I say to these young activists that I train around the world when they come to me and they say, are you okay with putting the CEO of one of the largest oil companies in the world in as the president of the COP?
The COP. So what is that?
You know what? When I listen to that, I had to scratch my head as well and say, what is the COP? So everyone, for our own knowledge, for our own edification, because again, these things are going on. A lot of people are watching social media and reality TV and taking a trip to Coachella and Dubai, and they don't know any of these things. They don't know that these things are going on. So what is the COP? What's Al Gore talking about? This is what Al Gore is talking about. What is the COP? COP stands for Conference of the Parties, which is a generic phrase in international relations speak, meaning a committee created after an international treaty is signed, tasked with making decisions about how that treaty is implemented. There are all kinds of COPs for various international agreements, from chemical weapons to combating desertification. But the term COP has come to be associated with meetings of one particular committee that created after the signing of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So what he was talking about there was apparently the individual put in charge of this particular COP is high up in the oil industry. That's what he was talking about there. So everyone, that's what the COP is, if you've never heard of it, at least as it relates to Al Gore and climate and petroleum products.
I see. Well, in the case of purely that question, should you make the active and currently serving CEO of an oil company in charge of that, the committee of parties, over the implementation of climate change policy? No. And whether or not that guy was actually going to make decisions based on his own bias to try and help his own company is irrelevant. You wouldn't do that anyway because you're allowing the possibility of bias to take place. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible idea. That's like putting someone on a jury. All right, so somebody murdered a police officer, and then in the jury selection process, the guy says, "I think he's innocent," and then they just go, "Yeah, put him on the jury." You wouldn't do that. Or,
Okay.
There's a guy in jury selection who used to be a cop 10 years ago, and he doesn't know either party. But the fact is like he may or may not have a clear personal bias, but he certainly could, and you don't want even the appearance of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that would be a terrible decision just from a purely logical standpoint anyway. Although Diaspora L, so I think he was actually, as I recall here before the last time I talked, Africa is well aware of this. I'm of the small census that even nuclear people still need to mature. Yes, we certainly do. We have a lot of technology still to develop. Mini nuclear is a great step. There's more opportunity to make it greener since it's already considered a source of clean energy. Yes. Oh, yeah. So one of the challenges we run up against is uranium mining and uranium processing and the chemistry to be able to do that, to make fuel. And so we've been constantly trying to develop new technologies and new ways to actually mine uranium from the earth that have a minimal amount of environmental impact and are much greener. We have the ability to do this now called leachate, where we actually find uranium sands. We do this in Wyoming, we do this in Alaska. We did formerly do this in places like the Navajo Nation, unfortunately. And you can mine, where you basically put well shafts down to where the uranium actually exists in the layer of soil. And then you use potash. So you use the basic ash from, well, we call it potash, but essentially you make water basic, and then it causes the uranium to actually become basic, and then it flows freely through the water, and then you suck it up at another wellhead. So you don't actually mine the earth, you don't actually disturb the soil, you don't actually poison the aquifers. You just use a slightly basic solution to cause uranium to get sucked up into another well. And from the water stage, we can actually make it into a powder, and from the powder, we can make it into a fuel. So we're trying everything that we possibly can to make the entire process, the whole resource process, as green as we can. Now, we're not there yet, and you're exactly right to point that out. We have a lot of places to go, but in order to get there, we need to keep working. The Ronan 5 says uranium mining has been destroying the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I'm not sure what the connection there is. Uranium isn't mined very much in Australia, and the uranium that is there that I'm aware of is mined mostly in the very center of the country, in the center of the landmass, far away from the Great Barrier Reef. So, I mean, if you know something I know, you very well might.
Okay, so I want to say salute to BGS Ibmore. He says they are running out of oil. They better figure this out. Salute to BGS Ibmore, who knows a lot about a lot of things. Connor, before I play the next Al Gore, the last Al Gore drop, where do we get the uranium from? Can we mine that here in the United States, or is that mined from Africa, or is it mined from Asia? Where does that come from?
So in the history of what we've done, in the very beginning, the uranium from the Manhattan Project actually came from the center of Africa, which at that time was the Congo, owned by Belgium. If you want to go into the history of the Belgian Congo, and there's no other word for it, it's actual atrocities on the African people, that's a whole different story. The US didn't really have anything to do with that. All we did was just buy the uranium, which existed very close to the surface in the Congo at that time. And that's where the uranium for the initial series of reactors that I talked about and the initial weapons that we had in the Manhattan Project came from. Over time, we ended up having a lot of uranium mining in our country. In the southwest corner of our country, there's a substantial amount of uranium. Like I said, wildcat mining, wildcat meaning non-regulated, outside of the law mining that was done in the 1950s and 60s was responsible for a lot of problems in the Navajo Nation, unfortunately. But we had it all over the southwest United States, Wyoming, Montana, Alaska. A lot of uranium that we use now comes from Canada. Canada has a huge amount of uranium. But up until the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, well, actually, it's been a little over a year ago, almost all of the uranium that we use for power and fuel came from Russia. Specifically, actually, from places of Russian influence. So it came from either Russia or specifically Kazakhstan. because there's a huge amount of uranium in Kazakhstan, and they use a leaching process like we do, but instead of using potash, which is just a mildly basic solution, they actually use hard acids to leach it out of the soil, which ruins the land and it ruins any potential aquifers. But Kazakhstan can get away with it because nobody lives there in the places where they do this mining. For thousands of kilometers, there's just no real population center there. So they can do whatever they want to get the uranium, which is what makes it cheaper, which is why we bought it from them. Now that Russia invaded the Ukraine, there's the uranium that we may or may not get is actually kind of a political football at the moment. But it's causing a lot of uranium companies here in the United States to rethink where they get theirs from. And we're going to start turning back to Canada and hopefully back to internal processing here in the United States, because we have enough. It's just more expensive to do it here than it was to buy it from a third world country. Go figure.
Okay. I want to go back to a BGS Idmore's comment. And I was thinking about this as I've been studying this climate debate, because it is a debate. Regardless of which side you're on, if we're going to run out of fossil fuels eventually, there's going to have to be something else. So that I came to that epiphany a little while ago. The bottom line is it's not going to go on forever. So there needs to be something else.
Yeah.
So speaking of which, I'm going to play this last Al Gore drop, and I want to ask you something about this.
Sure.
If you look at all the new electricity generation installed worldwide, 90% of it was renewable. It's now the cheapest source of electricity in almost the entire planet.
Is that accurate? Because I heard what I heard was that countries like, I think Germany, they tried to go over to more electrical. They tried to get rid of most of their fossil fuels, and that transition didn't go as planned. But is that accurate?
So,
and this is not to disparage Al Gore, everyone. This is not to disparage
Al Gore. And I'll stick. I can even stay away from politics on this one. So he was right in the spirit of what he wanted to say. What he actually said is not true. So he said that what he wanted to say was that the amount of renewable energy, in his mind, renewable energy is solar and wind power, and to a certain extent hydroelectric power, is what's being most invested in and what's being most installed in the world currently. And that is very true. The new energy infrastructure that we're building is mostly from those sources. And that's not a bad thing at all. But to say that it's the cheapest source of power is not true. In terms of kilowatt hours, the cheapest source of power we have is currently still coal-fired power plants, because they've always been there, and we don't need to build new infrastructure, and we don't need to subsidize the building of that infrastructure for it just to exist. So if you want to look at disparities here, Germany and France are going to be the two case studies that you want. So Germany had a reasonable amount of nuclear power, actually. And then after Fukushima, Germany tried to really step away from its nuclear power generation. And they tried to divest nuclear power. They shut down many nuclear power plants, and they tried to build a lot more renewable resources, wind, solar, hydroelectric, things like that. But they just couldn't get enough of it built to really satisfy the energy demand. And they were still very dependent on oil, specifically Russian oil. And so after Russia invaded Ukraine and cut off those taps to that oil, Germany actually faced an enormous energy crisis because it had a huge shortfall of its energy availability, since its oil that it had been buying from Russia was no longer there. So Germany actually swiftly rethought its position on nuclear power, and is actually planning on, the last I had heard, was planning on bringing back online some of the nuclear power plants that they had shuttered before, and potentially building new ones. France is on the opposite tack. So France actually in the 1960s and 70s went almost completely to nuclear power. Even today, the percentage of generation of power that they have is 70% of France's power comes from nuclear, which is by a significant margin the highest in the world. And the reason they were able to get away with that is because in the 60s and 70s, France was ruled by a guy named Charles de Gaulle, who was functionally a dictator and who could just order that to happen, and then it would happen, because democracy wasn't really a real thing in France until de Gaulle was dead. So France, because it has such a high generation of nuclear power, when Russia invaded Ukraine and decided to cut off the oil supply to Europe, the only country of Europe that was laughing about that was France, because they just didn't care. France never had an energy crisis. They never had a shortfall or anything like that. And they even have what's called a closed loop fuel cycle, where the fuel that they burn in their nuclear reactor actually goes to a chemical processing plant where they turn it into brand new fuel. And it's an incredibly, incredibly efficient process that causes very little waste generation. That's been illegal to do in the United States since Jimmy Carter was president, because he made a federal law that prevents us from actually reprocessing fuel, since the fear was that it would cause nuclear proliferation. You could make weapons material out of the old fuel. But if we can just close our fuel cycle loop, then we will have equally as efficient an energy generation infrastructure as France would, and we could continue on into the future, and we could help other countries to similarly do that. The political stability to be able to give other countries access to nuclear power has always been a huge sticking point. So the technology that we're using now, old nuclear power technology, uses highly enriched uranium. So about 95, 96, well, not quite that much, about 90% enriched uranium, which you can either make a weapon out of directly, depending upon how much it was enriched, or use very little energy to keep enriching it just a little bit more to then turn it into a weapon. So the kinds of nuclear reactors that we're dealing with now use something called HALEU, which is called high assay, low enriched uranium, which is about 19.7%. The cutoff for low and high enrichment is 20% enriched. So we're using fuel which is 19.7-ish% enriched. So that way we could give it to a third world country as a source of power and not really have to worry about them using it to make atomic weapons, because the amount of energy that it would take, the amount of knowledge it would take to turn that fuel into a weapon is so substantial that we would catch them in the act long before they ever got there.
Okay. I think that's probably a good place to wrap up. BJ Edmore says they bought into Nord Stream. I don't know what Nord Stream is. Looks like you're shaking your head, so you know.
Nord Stream is the enormous gas pipeline that flows under the North Sea from Russia to the rest of Europe. And the Nord Stream pipeline is what essentially fed most of Europe from Russia. And so that was what was blown up right after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that was a huge political issue for a decade, even before that, when it was getting built. And so the financing for what made Nord Stream came from European countries essentially funding Russia, funding Gazprom and Russian billionaires and Putin himself in order to get to win enough Russian political favor to get that pipeline built so that they wouldn't face energy crises. In order to do that, they essentially gave Putin enough money and license to be able to do things like invade Ukraine 10 years later.
Okay. So Nord Stream was the pipeline going from, well, is the pipeline going from Russia to Western Europe?
Western Europe, right.
How about
And
that?
so the other aspect, which I can finish off with this, is if we were able to develop nuclear technology to the point where we had nuclear batteries and we could safely give them to other countries without fear of nuclear proliferation, we, as Americans, or from anybody else as first world countries, would no longer actually have to deal with the demands of third world dictators and people like Putin and other countries in order to get energy either for ourselves or for their own people. We could actually sidestep them entirely, and we wouldn't start having to deal with this. I don't want to speak ill of any specific country, but we wouldn't have to deal with dictators to get what we need done anymore.
Well, okay, so everyone, this is not to disparage the current administration, but that was one of the when they took office, they, under the previous administration, that they were greenlighting that pipeline, and with the hope of making us energy independent. If I'm misspeaking,
no, that was the
correct.
idea. They wanted
so that we wouldn't be dependent upon countries like Russia,
Saudi Arabia, Russia, China,
and lo and behold, so
right.
Funny how that all works out.
So imagine a world where every country was completely energy self-sufficient. So the only amount of politics that we had to deal with was normal politics of things like trade and cultural politics. You didn't actually have pressure points where other countries had to just cow down to the demands of other countries because one had energy and the other didn't. You could actually have countries stand up as free peoples and engage with each other on an even platform from a cultural perspective. And that, by the way, this is a totally different story, but if we actually had complete energy independence for all the peoples of the world, then that would actually go a significant way to dealing with things like inequities, which you could say exist internationally as well as in our own society. Because if everyone had access to the same level of energy, the same ability to do things or to make things happen, then it actually makes the disparities just in terms of actual money or earning potential a lot less relevant. Because if somebody living in, well, Anwar, you and I both see, and I used to live in East Baltimore. If somebody living in an East Baltimore apartment block had the same access to energy and the ability to actually exist with roughly the same quality of life of someone living in the Hamptons or Upper New York, well, there would be much less of a fundamental difference between how their lives worked out.
Mm-hmm. BGS says water and energy runs the world. Okay. All right, Connor, do you have anything else? This is my second week with a 2-hour discussion. So
it's been fun. I've had a great time.
I've learned a ton.
I'll bring visual aids next time. I'll show you cool pictures of the early development of nuclear power and the cool old photos from the 50s of all the crazy experiments that they ran in the desert, all the truly insane things we could never get away with today. I'll show you all of it if you want.
You have a question here. I don't think he's a Baltimorean. I think it was a stop on his journey.
So Aquatechie, too much money to be made keeping things in balance. That is also very true. So for me, I was actually born in Denver, Colorado. I was raised in Colorado, but I went to school at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And I got my first master's degree there as well at the School of Public Health. So for the first 5 years of my school career, I lived in Baltimore. Some of it was in East Baltimore. Which I have some fond and some less fond memories of, for sure.
Well, I mentioned my mother in the Bible. I wanted to go to Morgan State, and she said you can't go to Baltimore because it's too dangerous. So that was that, But
yep. I wanted to be a Marine, and my parents said, "Well, you can't do that; it's too dangerous."
Okay. All right, Connor. We'll talk momentarily offline. I'm going to say goodbye to my audience here. So thank you.
It's been a pleasure. And if you guys think of other questions, you can ask Anwar and he can get them to me and I'd be happy to answer them.
Mm-hmm. But we'll have him back shortly. All right. Talk to you very soon.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. I'm going to wrap this discussion up. Thank you to those of you who watched and listened. This is a science and technology channel, so the topics vary, but this one in particular is critical because we hear so much about this, and in the next, you have a presidential election coming up, so you're probably going to hear about energy. You're probably going to hear about electric cars and alternative renewable fuels. You're going to hear a lot about this, and a lot of the population, at least in this country, is not paying attention. And so this is not to disparage anyone, but people make decisions on how well a candidate can dance and how well they can play the saxophone and all these other signals. But do individuals understand what's being talked about? Do they understand the policies? Do they understand the issues? Well, this is a huge issue that's going to impact all of us. And if you have children and grandchildren, it's going to impact them going forward. Is there still going to be an Earth in 10 years? Is there still going to be an Earth in 20 years? Are the oceans boiling? What's happening? So general knowledge. This is important for general knowledge. Most of you all know that Ronan said, great discussion. I learned quite a bit.
Yeah, okay. So I went from Aquatechie too.
Yep. Please consider joining my Big Words LLC newsletter. This will be one of the featured links in, if not this month's newsletter, one of the upcoming ones. There's a 2-paragraph greeting there. You just hit that subscribe button and it takes you there. Please sign up. And with that, I may do one more live stream next week before I go on hiatus. I'm going to be on the move in August a little bit, and it's good to take some time off from everything. So you'll probably see pre-records and maybe some shorts on this channel in August, but probably no live streams unless it's absolutely necessary. So with that, everyone, please like, share, and subscribe. If you want to donate something to the channel, that information is below in the description box. It's been shared all throughout in the chat there. And if there are any, I'm going to try to leave the materials Connor shared in the description box below for the playback. And yeah, thank you for viewing. And if you're watching on the playback, please leave a comment if you have comments or questions or thoughts. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your Saturday. As always, remember that your attitude determines your altitude. Always try to do your best. Take care, and I'll talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.